For over 2,000 years, fragile scrolls lay hidden in desert caves near the Dead Sea. When they were finally discovered in 1947, the world believed they had uncovered the oldest surviving biblical texts. But here's the twist. Inside those ancient parchments, scientists found something no one expected: DNA. And that genetic code revealed a mystery that could completely change what we thought we knew about the origins of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are often called the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century, hidden for centuries inside desert caves. These fragile manuscripts contain the oldest surviving copies of the Hebrew Bible, along with texts that reveal the religious debates of ancient Judaism. But ever since their discovery, one question has haunted scholars: who actually wrote them? Were they produced by a single community living in isolation at Qumran? Or do they represent a much wider collection of voices from across Judea? For decades, archaeology alone couldn't answer this. But modern science stepped in. By extracting tiny traces of DNA from the animal skins used to make the parchments, researchers began piecing together a genetic puzzle. And what they uncovered was shocking evidence that some scrolls came from sheep and goats that were not local to Qumran, suggesting the scrolls may have traveled across ancient Israel before ending up in those caves. In the next chapters, we'll explore how DNA solved this mystery, what it tells us about the diversity of ancient Jewish thought, and why these discoveries still matter today. Chapter 1: The Discovery That Shook the World. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd wandering the cliffs near the Dead Sea tossed a stone into a cave and heard the sound of pottery shattering. Inside, he found jars filled with rolled-up manuscripts that had been untouched for nearly 2,000 years. What followed was one of the greatest archaeological hunts of the 20th century. Over the next decade, archaeologists uncovered thousands of fragments from 11 different caves around the site of Qumran. These fragments were painstakingly pieced together into hundreds of manuscripts. The discovery was revolutionary. For the first time, we had access to biblical texts written 1,000 years earlier than the oldest copies previously known. Imagine the excitement. Suddenly, scholars could compare these ancient versions with later ones and see how faithfully the texts had been preserved. But with that excitement came a burning question: who created and stored these scrolls? Were they the work of a small Jewish sect living near Qumran, perhaps the Essenes, or had the caves been used as a hiding place during turbulent times, filled with writings collected from across the land? For decades, researchers debated fiercely, and just when it seemed like the mystery had reached a dead end, science offered a surprising way forward. What if the real key to the scrolls wasn't the writing at all, but the DNA of the animals on which they were written? Chapter 2: Unlocking the DNA of Ancient Parchment. For years, scholars focused on the words written on the Dead Sea Scrolls. But then scientists asked a different question: what about the parchment itself? Most of the scrolls were written on animal skins, mainly goats and sheep. Tiny scraps, too fragile to study through traditional methods, still carried microscopic traces of DNA from those animals. And that meant each scroll had a kind of biological fingerprint. Using advanced techniques, researchers carefully extracted and sequenced this DNA. What they found was astonishing. Not all scrolls were made from the same species or even the same regional herds. Some scrolls matched goats that were native to the Judean desert, suggesting they were prepared locally at Qumran. But others carried the DNA of sheep that could not have come from the desert region. These must have originated elsewhere, meaning parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls collection had been brought in from beyond Qumran. This breakthrough changed everything. The scrolls were no longer seen as the product of a single isolated community. Instead, they might represent a much wider spectrum of Jewish life and thought during the Second Temple period. If some scrolls were imports, what do they reveal about the connections and the conflicts between Jewish communities across ancient Israel? Chapter 3. A window into ancient Jewish diversity. The DNA findings did more than track animal skins. They opened a window into the diversity of Jewish thought 2,000 years ago. For decades, the dominant theory was that a single sect, often thought to be the Essenes, produced and stored the scrolls. But the genetic evidence painted a different picture. These manuscripts warranty the voice of just one group. Some scrolls contained texts that closely matched later versions of the Hebrew Bible, showing remarkable consistency over centuries. Others, however, included variations, alternative readings, or writings that never became part of the biblical canon at all. This suggests something powerful. The scrolls reflect not a single tradition, but a vibrant conversation among Jewish communities, debates about law, ritual, and the very meaning of Scripture. They show us that Judaism in the Second Temple period wasn't monolithic. It was alive, dynamic, and sometimes divided. And in a way, the DNA results confirmed what the texts themselves hinted at. These caves preserve the voices of multiple communities, brought together during a time of cultural tension and looming crisis. But what crisis forced people to hide these priceless manuscripts in desert caves? And why were they never recovered? Chapter 4. War, Destruction, and the hidden caves. To understand why the Dead Sea Scrolls were hidden, we need to step into the turbulent world of the first century. This was a time of deep unrest in Judea. The Roman Empire controlled the land, and tensions between Jewish groups and Roman authority were rising to a breaking point. In 66 CE, the first Jewish revolt erupted. Villages were burned, cities destroyed, and eventually Jerusalem itself fell in 70 CE, along with the Second Temple. It was during this storm of violence that the scrolls were likely hidden away in desert caves, placed in jars, wrapped for protection, and sealed in darkness. The people who hid them may have hoped to return, but history shows they never did. The scrolls remained undisturbed for nearly 2 millennia, preserved by the dry desert air until that fateful discovery in 1947. This context explains why the DNA results are so important. If the scrolls came from multiple regions, it suggests they were gathered, maybe in desperation, to preserve the wisdom and traditions of different Jewish communities during a time when everything seemed on the edge of collapse. But here, some most surprising part. One small piece of DNA evidence didn't just connect scrolls across regions. It actually reunited fragments that scholars thought had nothing to do with each other. Chapter 5: Reuniting Lost Fragments. One of the biggest challenges with the Dead Sea Scrolls is that most of them survive only in fragments. Thousands of tiny pieces scattered like a giant jigsaw puzzle. For decades, scholars tried to match fragments by handwriting style, language, and content, but some pieces just didn't seem to fit. That's where DNA changed the game, by comparing the genetic fingerprints of parchment fragments. Scientists discovered that certain pieces thought to belong to entirely different scrolls actually came from the same animal skin. In other words, DNA reunited fragments that human eyes alone could never have matched. Suddenly, new texts began to take shape, and long-lost connections came into focus. This breakthrough didn't just solve puzzles. It confirmed that the scrolls had been copied and circulated more widely than previously believed. The caves weren't just archives. They were time capsules of a culture desperately trying to preserve its sacred traditions. Chapter 6: The Final Revelation. The DNA evidence delivered something scholars had chased for decades. Proof that the Dead Sea Scrolls were not the work of one isolated sect, but a collection shaped by multiple Jewish communities across ancient Israel. Some scrolls were made locally at Qumran. Others traveled from distant regions before being hidden away in the caves. Together, they tell us that Judaism in the Second Temple period was far more diverse, complex, and vibrant than we once imagined. And perhaps that is the greatest revelation of all. These manuscripts survived not because of one group, but because of many, each contributing a piece of their faith, their traditions, and their identity to a library preserved by chance. In the end, the Dead Sea Scrolls are more than texts. They are voices carried through time, fragments of human struggle and hope, safeguarded by both desert caves and the hidden code of DNA. If you enjoyed uncovering this mystery, don't forget to subscribe for more stories where history meets science. Leave a comment. What surprised you most about the DNA discovery? And hit like to support our journey into the past. Because sometimes the answers to history's greatest puzzles aren't written in ink, but in the very fabric of life itself.